Hi everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and today I'm here with Fern Schumer Chapman on this very important episode that we're going to be talking about today. And today's title is going to be Why Are You Estranged? Or, for newcomers, Estrangement 101. Because this is such an important topic for us, of course, to get into, and we'd like to really be able to delve deeper into this for newcomers that are just getting on board with us to be able to, of course, explore this, because oftentimes we have people coming to us and telling us how they are bewildered by their experience and they recognize that sibling estrangement is a thing. So we'd like to delve deeper into that today, especially. So thanks so much for being here, Fern.
Great to be with you as always. It's interesting that even the word estrangement is somewhat foreign to some people. They don't know what it is and what we're talking about. In fact, so much so that when I was conducting a survey for my book, Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, one of my friends saw my request for respondents. And he's a 63-year-old man who basically wrote me and said, "Am I estranged?" And here was his story. "I hear from my brother once in a while when someone dies or when our mother is ill in the hospital. Once a year or so, I'll leave a message on my birthday for some or another reason, but I haven't really talked to him or his wife in years. Is this estrangement?" My answer was yes.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that we're able to contextualize this, right, with these real life stories, right? Because it's so important for us to show people how this is something that happens to us, right? And how this can continue to affect us in the present moment in so many different ways, right?
And there are very specific definitions for estrangement. And I think at this point, it's important for us to define it. What is it? Well, Dr. Christina Sharp, who is an assistant professor and director of the Family Communication and Relationships Lab at the University of Washington, has given us a very succinct definition. And here it is. It is a process where at least one family member voluntarily or intentionally distances themselves from another family member because of an ongoing perceived negative relationship.
Absolutely. And that is one particular definition that a lot of our viewers will be very familiar with, right? And
right. So in the case of this friend, clearly his brother and sister-in-law were withdrawing and putting up a fairly large wall between them because there was no contact, no conversation, or I should say very little contact and no conversation of any import.
of course, and that's what happens oftentimes is, right, we have this type of situation where we're not able to express our potential, right? And that's the thing that makes this hard is we're curbing ourselves because there's nobody there to be able to express what's already within us, right? And there's so much of this going on in our community. It's so important that we keep on putting words to this. And another way of doing that is, of course, coming up with other types of definitions, of course, because there's more than one definition, right? And Merriam-Webster dictionary, for example, describes estrangement as being to arouse especially mutual enmity or indifference in someone where there had been formerly love, affection, or friendliness, right? So
Right.
it underscores that change in the relationship, which is what we're talking about.
And I think it's always important to say that there are some relationships that are simply too toxic and hurtful to maintain. And so really we're talking about a broad range of estrangement, and we'll get into the extremes as well. But sometimes you have to cut off because you cannot continue to get injured and hurt with that and sustain your well-being.
I agree. I think that that's important for us to be able to say that, especially, right? It's important for people to understand that sometimes you have to do it out of necessity for your own well-being, for your own sustenance and such, right? So it's not a bad thing for people to establish those boundaries because it just means that you're stopping toxic behavior. you're not enabling it to continue on. So sometimes you have to choose to be able to do that for your own well-being, right? For your own peace of mind.
So now that we have the definition, Ali John, what does it look like in real life?
Well, that's a very important question, so we can help to contextualize this for our viewers, right? Oftentimes, a universal experience of this will be a sense of reduced communication, right? The idea that there's a noticeable decrease in phone calls, texts, or in-person visits, right? Or it could just be outright silence and not have any of that whatsoever, right? So that's one of the defining hallmarks of sibling estrangement, of course. Of course, there's avoidance. Of course, that's another one, right? Avoiding family gatherings or events where they might be present. So sometimes you can see that where there's people will be declining invitations or just not showing up, especially. And of course, emotional distance is another one, right? That sense of emotional detachment or coldness that happens, I think, with certain family members. And usually we can really feel that lack of warmth, affection, or empathy, just to name a few things right now.
Yeah, I think we know it when we feel it, and it's very uncomfortable. The problem is that most people who are enduring sibling estrangement don't have strong communication skills. So instead of sitting down and saying, I'm uncomfortable with the direction our relationship has taken, and can we begin a process of hearing each other and understanding each other, they simply leave it alone and avoid confrontation. And if you avoid confrontation, you can be pretty well assured that the pattern will continue.
I absolutely agree. I think that's the problem. I think when communication breaks down, right? There's these unresolved conflicts, and that creates hostility, an uncomfortable atmosphere when the family member's around, or as we were saying earlier, when a family member attempts to get other family members to understand what is happening and trying to essentially have people choose sides, unfortunately, right? And that type of stuff does happen sometimes, and it's really hard to walk on a narrow line where you don't want to choose sides, right? Especially, and that's the thing that can even foster estrangement in some ways, right? That they want for people to choose sides, and this can just make estrangement even worse because it leaves people with feelings of hurt and betrayal, right? And that's the whole basis of it. If you find somebody's not with you, well, are they against you? And it becomes very black and white, right? If we're not careful with what it does to the mind.
Well, the way I see it, Ali John, is it's almost like a cancer in the family. And what happens is it can easily metastasize to other family members in the smallest and simplest ways. So if you do not choose to support somebody or even listen to somebody who is estranged, you may be identifying or somehow perceived to be identifying in support of the other person. And this is where it gets so gnarly and complicated.
Yes, I agree. It gets very muddy when we start to look at it from that vantage point because there doesn't need to be sides taken in situations like this. It's the hurt that's making decisions in some cases, and sometimes rightly so, right? Like we said, if there's toxic behaviors, we need to, of course, recognize that it's healthy to have those boundaries, but it's what it does to us, right? It's how it deteriorates after the fact, right? And that's what creates a lot of the issues because people can feel unsupported or unloved by a family member, especially during times of need or crisis. Just you and I, we were talking about how health concerns can somehow change people all of a sudden and make them realize like what's really important in life, right?
Right. Which raises a very good point, and that is sometimes you don't know the reasons why someone is withdrawing. And there could be very legitimate reasons. Maybe they're having marriage problems. Maybe they're having health problems. Maybe they're hiding a vice like alcoholism.
Right.
But we tend to personalize it, and therefore that just feeds the resentments that occur in estrangement.
Exactly. And sometimes there's even incidences that happen within families, right? Disputes about inheritance,
Right.
differences in how funeral arrangements need to be made in some ways. These type of things that kind of end up creating misunderstandings and hostilities, unfortunately. And people can argue over financial matters as well too. So there can be all sorts of different things that will spark estrangement. It could be based on an incident that happened, or something that got just turned into a whole different direction, right? in terms of what the intention was. Perhaps initially it was based on a misunderstanding.
And I want to say here that when I was doing the research for the book, I discovered two remarkable things, and that is that there are actually risk factors for estrangement, and we've discussed that in some of our other episodes. And there are also perilous moments in a sibling relationship. So anytime the relationship changes, so if somebody goes off to college, if somebody gets married, if somebody has a child, that etc., that will create new challenges and strains and a moment of volatility and vulnerability in the relationship.
Absolutely. Change can certainly come and interfere, if you will, into other types of relationships that will, of course, create stress. And how we deal with that stress can manifest in all sorts of different ways, right? And it can affect us in all sorts of different ways, of course, you know. So I think emotional pain and distress is one of those types of situations that will, of course, foster an estranged relationship or to strain a particular sibling estrangement, you know. So I think that that's really, really important to be able to, of course, highlight that. And of course, it can affect other family members, other relationships. You know, it can have a ripple effect through the entire family system, sometimes generational effects with the offspring as well, too, which I think especially is something that some of our viewers are concerned with, you know.
Right. It becomes very, very painful when you're cut off from nieces or nephews and you have no recourse.
Yeah, exactly. So let's get to the most important question. What can we do now when it comes to this, right? And I think that that's something that's really, really important for our viewers to know because, you know, I think that at the same time that we can experience a sense of pain, you know, that's characterized often with estrangement and such, you know, it's important to recognize that there are directions that we can take. And one of them is to learn to grieve the relationship of a living person, right? To recognize that they can be absent from our lives, and that there's that type of ideal that we were saying earlier that is never fully expressed, and that there needs to be an acknowledgement of that particular type of grief. I think that's one of the first steps that we need to recognize that it's a thing.
And I would add to that that there is a tremendous amount of fantasy involved in sibling relationships. And as a result, you need to be very realistic about what this relationship is and not what you want it to be. So you need to grieve that it's not what you expected and what you wish for.
Absolutely. We need to come back to reality in terms of what it can be and such, right? Because it involves two people, right? It involves an interpersonal dynamic process going back and forth. So invariably, there's going to be a chemistry that comes. And the important thing, of course, is to have a type of chemistry that's not domineering, that's not attempting to get a one up on the other person, that you don't get into a power struggle and such. And sometimes you have to take a step back from that. If the other person's unable to do that, you kind of have to set those boundaries to not get involved in that type of thing, right? So that's really, really important. And the other thing that's also important for us to recognize is to build meaning and belonging outside of a familial context, right? And it's important that you find your tribe of people, right? And the type of people that accept you for who you are, that enjoy your company. And this is really a pivotal step, I think, in healing from sibling estrangement. It's to be able to find those people, that community, you know. And I think that connecting with our own community, of course, is a good way for people to recognize that they're not alone and that it's an important action step they can take, of course, to empower themselves.
There is a deep need to belong, which actually is rooted in evolutionary biology. If you did not have others to protect you hundreds and hundreds of years ago, you didn't survive. So we have that built into our DNA, and we have a need to belong somewhere. People have a go-to, which is the family, but it doesn't have to be the family. As you said, find your tribe.
Exactly. And that can be friends, for example. It could be different people in the community that you identify with, you know, whoever it is that you feel can help you to do that, then that's great because that's where you can express your potential, right? And that's what we were talking about initially. You're curbing your potential, but when you find that person, that go-to person, then all of a sudden you have an outlet to be able to express yourself and experience that sense of authenticity in a relationship.
I do want to add one thing to this, which I read on the page quite a bit, and that is that what happens when somebody gets cut off by a sibling is they often feel they can't trust anybody. And then they feel they can't trust friends. And so this has a huge ripple effect, not just in the family, but in all other relationships. And I think it's important to become mindful of that tendency.
I absolutely agree. I think that it's important to address that and to be able to look at that because, of course, a sibling estrangement relationship, like you said, can generalize itself. It can go into different places and, like you said, affect different relationships. And in fact, I would even go further to say that it affects one's self-esteem, which is why I'm doing the workshop about that, to be able to help people improve their self-esteem in particular because of that.
Right.
So
I've heard over and over again, Ollie John, if I can't sustain a relationship with my brother, what am I worth? Who can I sustain a relationship with?
exactly.
So, these are fundamental relationships and we do generalize them.
Absolutely. So, it's important for people to recognize how this can play on us in that way, right? It can play on us when it comes to rumination and personalization as well, right? In terms of kind of going back into past incidences and reliving them in our own heads when they didn't turn out well. And this is really important for people to understand, right? That this is a process where the mind's looking for answers. And if we're not careful, we can fall into a whirlpool that can become really challenging for us, right? And we have to find a way to help to make that stop. And we've discussed ways in which we can work with rumination, you and I, before, especially.
Mm-hmm. Well, and getting back to what you said a few minutes ago, the grief. This is, as I always say, this is mourning the living.
Yep.
You do not have the relationship you want with somebody who's walking on the planet because they've chosen to stop it. And
exactly.
Honestly, Allie John, I don't think there's anything more painful because it's not ever final. There's always a crack in the door. There's always the hope. It's not like a death where you can't negotiate with that.
No, and I think that you're right. There's a certain omnipresence that comes with this, and I kind of see myself, catch myself every now and then kind of going into a thought pattern that way. But of course, I use the tools, of course, that we share with others to be able to, of course, help myself to get less into that. And another thing that we do recommend, of course, is to self-regulate our emotions because we know, of course, of the relationship between thoughts and feelings. And there's ways that we can help, of course, to make that the tape doesn't play itself out, and how to work with feelings to also reduce the impact of that hurt and that rejection, that comes with being estranged.
Right. And a lot of that, by the way, I applaud you for your workshops on self-esteem because a lot of that comes from a higher self-esteem.
Yeah, exactly. So once we reclaim ourselves, it becomes really important because we empower ourselves.
Right.
And ultimately, we end up being able to, of course, validate our feelings, work with the feelings that need to be worked with, and also soothe ourselves, take care of ourselves, So, really important.
I
And
agree.
yeah, and another thing, of course, is to learn to protect yourself in family situations, right? This is the number one thing we suggest to people, of course, is to prioritize your emotional and physical safety. When it comes to the situations that are occurring with the problem of sibling estrangement, right? So
I think thinking about armor is very important. And you've talked about it in the past. It always helps to have something visual, and you need to have some pretty good armor on in order not to get hurt.
I absolutely agree with that. And it's interesting that we bring this up because that is something I do recommend to some people I work with, that, of course, using active imagination in different ways is very important when it comes to establishing those boundaries, and some practical matters that I suggest, some practical actions that are suggested to people is to choose essentially to, of course, stick with safe people when you're going to a family event, should you choose to go, right? And give yourself an exit strategy if things go from bad to worse, right? Know that you can have a plan B just in case something happens, right? And of course, even declining certain family events can also be another option. You're free to say no if you need to.
Right. Protecting yourself has to be the priority.
Exactly. So I think that's a good way to end on today's topic. So let's talk about resources, Fern. Let's talk about what it is that's your number one resource at this time for our viewers that you'd like to talk about.
Well, I've been doing one-on-one coaching, and that has been enriching my life in many ways, and I'm learning more and more as I talk to individuals about the deep challenges of negotiating estrangement.
Absolutely, very important. And my number one resource right now is the ongoing support group that we have on Zoom. And that's very, very important for people to recognize that we do this twice monthly, and that people can join in to meet a community of like-minded people that are experiencing estrangement. And the group has a very empowering feel to it. This is really what I like to do, is I like to uplift people to be able to help them to, of course, keep on walking in dignity in their situation, of course, that I'm familiar with, you're familiar with, and all of us are experiencing, of course, to some degree. So there's ways for us to empower ourselves, and coming together, breaking isolation is certainly one of them. So,
Right, and recognizing that you cannot control somebody else's choices.
exactly. So thank you so much for doing this today, Fern. I'm very happy with being able to talk about this, especially with newcomers that are just getting on board, just finding out about us, discovering what is sibling estrangement. I think that today's episode has been very informative and illuminating in terms of what we can do, especially when it comes to this.
Well, you won't find Estrangement 101 in your college book, but you will find it here.
Very much so. So thank you for promoting this conversation for us to be able to put words to this situation that is, of course, very important to our hearts and to the hearts of our viewers. So I look forward to our next episode, Fern. Thank you so much.
I do too. Bye now.
Take care. Bye-bye.